Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby and this is my co-host,
Christopher Walls.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so we are back at it again with another off-season review. And this time we're going to do a couple of playing teams. We're going to look at the Miami Heat and the Dallas Mavericks. I guess we'll start with the Mavs. I think they're going to be the more interesting team of the two. So the Mavs, obviously, last year, coming off of the trip to the NBA Finals, everybody thought, ourselves included, right, that the Mavs would be maybe better than last year, right? I don't think either of us picked them to go to the finals. I think I had Luka as my MVP pick, but both of us felt like Oklahoma City was the best team in the Western Conference, but they did struggle early. Luka was hurt, and the team was kind of up and down. Then eventually Luka comes back. They start to find their footing. Kyrie plays great. Then Luka goes down again on Christmas, and then we don't see him again. And as it turns out, that was his last game as a Mav, right? Because, of course, we all remember back in February, the big trade that sent Luka to LA for Anthony Davis and Max Christie. So now the Mavs are in a completely different spot where, after that trade, we got to see some of what it looked like with, Anthony Davis and Nico Harrison's vision of all this size and all this defense. But we only really got to see it for a half because AD gets hurt, and then he doesn't come back until a little bit later, and the Mavs struggle. Kyrie gets hurt, torn ACL, and then that pretty much ends the Mavs' hopes for last season. So now, going into this season, they got a little bit of luck on their side because they got the number one pick in Cooper Flagg from Duke, and of course, that's the guy that everybody kind of thought was the best player in the draft. Some think he's generational. But I think when we saw him in the Summer League, right, you can definitely see all of the versatile skill sets, right? He's a very good athlete. He can get out in transition. They had him have the ball a lot in his hands in Summer League so he could make some decisions, make the extra pass. The team didn't always score because they didn't have a lot of talent. But he can do a lot of really good things. Even, like I said, defensively, right? With the fact that he can switch and guard multiple positions, use his length, use his athleticism, use his size. Of course, at the NBA level, it's going to look a little bit different, right? He probably won't start off as like an A-plus, A-tier defender like he did in college, but he should still be good on that end. And then offensively, still a work in progress as far as his jumper, right? Even the ball handling, right? Because, again, in college, right, the jumper and the ball handling looks a little bit different than it will in the NBA because of the defense and the speed and everything that you have to kind of adjust to. But either way, it's going to be really cool, I think, to see what he looks like just in that position, just because especially Kyrie is still going to be out with a torn ACL. They did re-sign him to a new deal this summer or a new extension, but we're going to have to see what it looks like without Kyrie for a decent chunk of the season. Now, not everybody thinks he'll be back this season. We don't know for sure because, we haven't really heard much in the last couple of months, other than I think Shams put out that he believes that, or the Mavs think that Kyrie could be back by like December, January. We'll just have to see. So we don't know about that. But they did sign D'Angelo Russell as a stopgap, right? Who I guess he's going to be the point guard. He's going to run a lot of the offense with Cooper Flagg, right, while Kyrie Irving is out. And again, we know regular season-wise, he can still be an effective, good player, right? Last year, he wasn't quite as great. When he was in LA, obviously the offense changed where he's no longer bringing the ball up and playing a lot with the ball in his hands, right? They prioritized Austin Reeves, which makes sense. Then he goes to Brooklyn. Brooklyn was kind of a messy team, so not a whole lot to read into there. But, again, he's played with some of the guys on the roster before, right? He fit very well next to Anthony Davis, right, as a pick-and-roll guy. Good passer, good shooter. So, again, at the contract he's being given, not really any real issues there. They extended Daniel Gafford. Bizarre a little bit, just because I kind of assumed that it would be sort of as like a trade piece, which it could be. But, they also have Derek Lively, right, who's their young guy, who's the guy that they should probably prioritize. So I'm curious to see how that looks, right? Which one starts? I'm assuming Lively. But, of course, it could be either one. They're both going to play a decent amount. This talks about them potentially extending P.J. Washington, right, who was a big part of their turnaround a year ago when they went to the finals. Again, different team now that Luka's not there. Now they kind of have a glut of a lot of front court guys not really a lot of perimeter players, especially ball handlers, right? Because, you still have Clay, right? But again, not a ball handler, mostly a shooter, off ball guy. Max Christie, right? Played very well in LA, then came to Dallas, right? The role was a little bit different. Started off great, and then kind of just tapered off. Again, I liked him as a player when he was in LA, so I think he'll be good as a 3-and-D guy there. Can attack closeouts, good athlete, good length, good rebounder. So, there's a lot of individual pieces to like on this team. It's just the issue is, do they all fit together? And that's kind of the problem and the question for this team. Especially, again, without Kyrie Irving, that's kind of your lone guy who's like a star level perimeter ball handler. Everyone else is either average or below average in that regard, right? Because again, without Kyrie, it's mostly going to be Flagg and D'Angelo Russell having the ball in their hands a lot. Obviously, Anthony Davis is going to have the ball in terms of scoring opportunities, right? But even though he's a good ball handler and decision maker for his position and for his size, he's not a point guard, even though he played point guard in high school, right? So you kind of have to figure out how to balance all of those different pieces there. What's the starting five while Kyrie's out? I mean, I'm going to assume D'Lo, Clay, Cooper Flagg, AD, and then probably Lively. I'm going to assume that's the starting group. But then how do you figure out how to balance everything else from there? Who's going to close? A lot of different questions there. But either way, the identity of the team, ton of size, ton of length, is, I think, a cool one. Just because, again, we've seen more of a comeback in the league with bigger teams that have multiple bigs, 2 big lineups. Dallas can do a lot of that. It's just like I said, the issue is kind of like what we said about Milwaukee. You just don't have a lot of guards. You don't have a lot of perimeter offense to balance it out and kind of put a lot of these bigs in the best position, right? Like that's what Luka was there for, but he's not there right now. So the hope is that A, Kyrie eventually comes back, and B, that Cooper Flagg right away is kind of in that elite tier, right? Obviously not necessarily all NBA, but just in the tier of, okay, this guy looks really good, especially for a rookie, and he's going to be great very quickly. If he progresses at a fast rate, that's going to make Dallas even better. And again, there's a lot here where you kind of look at it and you just kind of say to yourself, if you could move a couple of these pieces and, like I said, balance out the roster, you'd still have the makings of a really good team. Just because we know defensively they should be very strong. I just don't know about the offense, and that's kind of the question mark here. But again, you got Cooper Flagg in the draft, so that automatically puts you you had like a decent offseason tier because you got the number 1 pick in a draft where the number 1 pick is a guy that's supposed to be really, really good. Then, like I said, D'Lo as the fill-in for Kyrie, that's perfectly fine. Then extending those other guys, whether or not they're long-term or trade pieces, not too many issues with that. It's just, again, why did you trade Luka in the first place? We've already discussed and hammered that in a bajillion times. We know why Dallas did it. Doesn't mean that it makes sense. Doesn't mean we have to like it. Just the question is, okay, this is the roster that Dallas has now. How good can they realistically be? And that's where, again, you're banking on, 2 guys being healthy, and both of them are guys that, kind of have a tough history in terms of staying healthy. AD actually, prior to last year, had a couple of seasons where he played, 70 games or whatever. But unfortunately last year, right, then he had I think it was the adductor that he hurt, and then he was out for a decent chunk of last season. So if those guys are healthy and Cooper Flagg is really good, Clay's still good and all these other pieces come together, then, like I said, this could be a good team. But because we already know Kyrie's going to be out for at least a little while, that already, I think, caps the ceiling of what this team could be, at least regular season-wise. Either way, I give them a B for the offseason because, again, Cooper Flagg plus stuff, right, I think is a good combination to have. And they're not in the worst position that you could be in the league, right? Because, like, again, the best version of this team is a good team. But, again, without knowing when Kyrie's going to be healthy, and then, before I see Cooper Flagg play an NBA game, I'm not quite ready to put them in contender status just yet. If Kyrie comes back and he's perfectly fine and Cooper Flagg's really good, okay, then they'll have flexibility to make some trades. But, as of right now, ceiling probably is going to be somewhere around the play-in just because, again, is Kyrie going to play more than 40 games? I don't know.
Yeah, I give him a B for this offseason as well. I know a lot of people were like, yeah, Cooper Flagg equals automatic A. For me personally, I think I have to look at it from a broader perspective, right? I feel like I'm not going to say the offseason was lackluster or anything like that, but I feel like it wasn't, something that wowed me, right? Like, okay, yeah, getting Cooper Flagg is great. And like you already hinted at, there's a lot of luck involved with that. So the ping pong balls dropped their way. That's great. And pretty much outside of that, all they really did was bring in D'Lo in terms of additions. So that's where I kind of draw the line of between luck and actually going out and getting, some great additions. And D'Lo's fine, like you talked about. That's going to be a guy who's probably going to anchor them for the regular season, at that point guard position. How reliable is he going to be? I don't know. How is he going to fit in the system? I mean, in theory, right? They have so many defenders, on the wings and on the interior that, D'Lo can be hidden. The bad parts of D'Lo's game defensively can be hidden. I think it's going to be a matter of, all right, well, that's going to be a lot of usage for a guy when, we've already seen when his usage goes up, his efficiency goes down. So I am curious, what that's going to look like in terms of him running the offense. And I think that's everybody's question in terms of, what does this team look like offensively? Because you're going to have growing pains with Cooper Flagg. It's not going to just be, the Cooper Flagg show. It's just not going to happen. AD, what does he look like offensively? With a little bit of wear and tear and injuries and stuff like that. I mean, we already know that he was very dominant in LA, but what does he look like in this new system? Paired with some other ball dominant guys potentially. And then the Kyrie factor as well, like you talked about. What does that injury, look like down the line? Does he even play the season? Who knows? So that's where I kind of have to be measured, I think, with grading this team, because I can't just give them an automatic A because they got Cooper Flagg. But I think there is a lot of potential for this team to, make some waves defensively, and I'm excited for them. I think it was the best case scenario that could have happened post Luka, right? Like, it would have been horrible if they didn't get the number one pick. I'm sure we'd be talking about them very differently. We probably the grade would not be a B. I can tell you that.
No.
So. That is, I guess, the good consolation prize. Still really not over the fact that they even traded Luka in the first place. Probably will never get over that. But regardless, nothing. It wasn't like a home run offseason, but it was a good one. And it's obviously because they got Cooper Flagg.
Yeah. And for Anthony Davis, again, last year, when as a Laker, right, he averaged 26 and 12. And actually, in the early portion of the season, right, he was giving them he was averaging over 30 a game, right? Mm-hmm. There was a stretch where he was leading the league in scoring, because I remember, we were talking about that.
Yep.
And, how we were talking about, okay, new coach, even though it's a similar roster, right, it seemed like that they were kind of optimizing and prioritizing him in the offense, right? And then after that stretch, right, then there was a drop-off in terms of his numbers. Because, again, he's a great player. Even offensively, right? Again, for his career, he's averages 24 a game. It's just, it is kind of difficult to probably make him the number one option offensively for a really good team. Because on this team, right, he's the best player. But, again, like you said, how is the offense going to be distributed across everybody else? And then, say with a D'Angelo Russell, like you mentioned, defensively, you can hide him for sure. But you also mentioned his usage rate, but it's also who he's playing next to an offense, right? Because again, there is no other high-level ball handler that he's going to be playing with, say LeBron or, even whoever else you want to kind of put in that bucket, right? He's going to be the guy with the ball in his hands for most of it, other than Flagg, until Kyrie comes back. So, like you said, what does that look like? But either way, you could do a lot worse in terms of just we need a stopgap while Kyrie Irving is out than D'Angelo Russell.
Oh, yeah.
And again, the nice thing about him is he can shift into sort of a secondary, tertiary role, right, where he can spot up and, he can play without the ball in his hands. So you could have lineups where you play both of those guys together and have some juiced up perimeter lineups surrounded by, length and defense, which is why, like we talked about, the thing with this Dallas team is, like you said, this is the best case scenario post Luka trade, because you got a guy who could potentially be a superstar, right? Like an all NBA level guy. And again, that's a better starting point than some of these other teams, right? Where, again, say like a Sacramento, right? Like Sacramento, who may not even be better than Dallas next year, right? Now they're at a point where they don't have a franchise guy. right? Some of these other rebuilding teams, like we mentioned with Washington, right? Like right now, we don't know who the franchise guy is, but they're in an okay starting point. So like with Dallas, like you said, it would have gotten very ugly had they not been able to get the number one pick, because then it's like, okay, well then, say they had dropped to, well, I mean, again, they had the lowest odds of getting the number one pick, right? Because they were in the play-in. So, I mean, kind of a tough part there. But like you said, they lucked into that. And, now you have a good future point. What do you think of Cooper Flagg's ceiling, right? Because, I mean, again, maybe it's not a fair conversation to have just yet, but, there are a lot of people who feel like he's a generational guy. But, what do you think? Do you think he's going to be a generational talent, or do you think he's more so going to be in the line of like just really, really good?
Yeah, that's hard to judge. I mean, from what I've seen,
Yeah.
At every level, because I mean, everybody knows, we've watched him at every level. Like every hardcore basketball fan has watched this guy, at every single level. So I'm gonna go out and say that he's most likely generational. That's what it seems like to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
The shades are there, right? He obviously has the physicality to do so. He's young. He reclassed up, right? He's playing, he's playing guys who are old. Yeah, exactly. He's playing guys who are older than him. So that's number one, and already at a high level. And look at what he did at Duke, right? Phenomenal. The intangibles are there, right? Everybody around him speaks highly of him. Competitor. Yeah. I mean, he's got the whole package. I feel like it's just a matter of working hard, continuing to get better, right? I think people's number one question is probably going to be the jump shot. Does that transition to the NBA level? Because we've seen him struggle with that at times and for long periods of time, at every single level during high school, during college as well. So I am curious what that's going to look like, career-wise, percentage-wise, right? Is he going to be mediocre, or is it going to be above average to the point that, defenses aren't just going to sag off of him? Because I think that's going to be the problem, is how are teams going to guard the guy? And I think that's going to kind of dictate, what he truly can be. Because I don't want this to be another Zion situation, right? Where, we kind of label the guy as generational and then we don't really get anything out of it. So, I think the shades are there, right? And obviously defensively, that's the cool part, right? Like it's been a long time since we've seen, an elite two-way prospect like this, where, defensively out the gate, we already know that teams, you can't really target the guy,
Yeah, especially like, because again with Wemby, right, he's a center, right? And we already looked at him as being like an elite defensive big, right? Like that's another guy. But like you said, at the forward spot, right? The last few forwards who went number one, right? Like maybe you might look at them as good two-way players, right? Like Reese Shea, and some other ones. But like you said, Flag is a different breed. So I agree with you there. And again, like if in order for him to get to generational level, the jump shot does have to be, I think, much improved from what it is right now. And I think it can get there because, like you said, he's got all the tools and all the intangibles that you would want.
Yeah.
So I think you expect him to continue.
He's a willing passer, willing defender. Right. I'm telling you, he's got everything that you would want out of a generational talent.
And that's why if you're Dallas, regardless of what happens right now, you should be pleased that you got Cooper Flagg, because at the very least, you have something that you can build off of, as opposed to, like you said, imagine if they didn't get the number one pick, then they'd have nothing pretty much. I mean, after, like post AD Kyrie, you wouldn't have anything.
Right.
And how long are those two guys going to, continue to be viable, number one and number two options on a good team? We'll have to see. But either way, at least you have a good transitional period. So it's almost kind of like a two timelines thing. But, but honestly, beyond Flag, right, most of their other young players are not quite at that level. Like Lively's good, but we've already kind of seen, if he doesn't have some type of playmaking guard next to him, he's going to look at like a different player, mainly offensively. And then, after that, Christie's good. But again, obviously probably never going to be like an all-star plus level player. But, I do like him, and I think he'll be good and continue to be good. So after that, the other guy, the other guys on the roster, I mean, Hardy's still there, but he seems like he'll probably just be like a backup scoring guard. He doesn't really look like he's, going to be like a starting, caliber guy, but who knows? But either way, just kind of looking at this Dallas roster, I guess, if we're kind of just looking at the rest of it, what do you think? Like, just where do you view this team in terms of like the hierarchy in the Western Conference? Because,
Yeah.
like I said, I feel like if this team was fully healthy, like I wouldn't say championship team, but you could at least put them in like the contender tier, maybe like the lower end of it. But again, like I said, without a healthy Kyrie, and we don't know when he's coming back, that's where it's kind of hard for me to really put them in that mix. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think defensively, that's probably what's gonna carry a lot of their win total. But I don't really foresee them being like an eighth seed, seventh seed, six, or anything like that. I think they're gonna fall right into that play-in mix, which is fine. I think that's a good thing because you're gonna give Coop experience. Offensively, there are major questions, and I think though that's going to probably play a factor into their loss column. Kyrie's health that sucks. So I think there's too many things working against them here. But it's not a bad thing for them to be in the play-in, I think.
Yeah, so I guess kind of looking at it then, they're over under. If we're talking about like their odds in terms of their regular season wins is currently 40.5. So I guess the question is do we think that they're going to be over under, right? Because 40.5 wins, that's probably going to put you in the lower tier of the play-in because we already know like last year, I mean 47, 48 wins was like 7-8.
Yeah. I think they'll probably go under, if you want me to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm going under just because I think there's going to be growing pains with Flag. There's going to be issues like D'Lo's usage rate without Kyrie. 80's health as well. Hopefully that doesn't come into play, but I think it will. So yeah, I just think overall they're not a crazy durable team, but defensively, they'll make their mark, and that's what's going to carry their wins.
Probably go slight under as well because again I'm factoring in I don't know when Kyrie's coming back and I'm not going to bank on him coming back when it's reported. Like he may just not come back at all, who knows. But like you said, just putting Cooper Flag in there, it's going to be an experience. It's going to be a developmental experience for him. And like you said, there's going to be games where he's going to have to learn, and they may lose some games, not necessarily just because of him, but just because again they're trying to figure out how to develop him and everything along those lines. So I wouldn't expect this team, like you said, to be a 45 plus win team. I think it's probably more likely that they'll be a little bit under. But like you said, there's going to be nights where when they're at their best, they're going to look really good just because, defensively, they're going to shut a lot of teams down. But it's just offensively, I just have too many questions to expect them to be, really, really good.
Yeah.
And I think the offense would be helped with a healthy Kyrie Irving. It still wouldn't be perfect, but it'd be better than what it's probably going to be without him. And so that's kind of the tricky part there. But again, there's a pathway for them to be better than what we think. But it would, like I said, it would have to start with Kyrie coming back earlier than anticipated. And I just don't know how likely that is.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So either way, I guess, kind of looking at the Mavs, is there anything else that you're kind of questioning or kind of looking at from this roster? Maybe in terms of, I know this is mainly off-season review, but just in terms of like I guess since we're still kind of waiting on what's going to happen, like, do you think PJ Washington gets extended?
Yeah, that's interesting. I would assume so. They brought him in, and he was more than I think an energy guy. He was definitely their Swiss Army knife. And when his shot is falling, I think he makes the team way more dangerous. Than people would normally kind of think of them. So I think they have some good pieces. PJ Washington is a guy that I think should be on the radar. Klay Thompson, that's another guy. What does he look like this season? Because I think if he can, have a bounce back year, then Dallas's ceiling is good. I think you already talked about Max Christie. So I think there are guys on this team that depending on how they play, the ceiling could be a little bit better than maybe we think.
Yeah, they're pretty close to that first apron, it looks like, right? So I mean, I think they're $3,000 under the first apron. So pretty much once they re-sign PJ Washington, assuming they do, then they're a first apron team. So then that's going to be so that's going to be a little bit trickier for them to navigate in terms of figuring out how to properly manage and how to properly make moves and decisions for this team. So, like I said, I'm not sure what's going to happen there. Again, he was a pretty integral part to the team when they had Luka, but now he may just come off the bench, and just play a different role there. Still could play a lot, but I don't know. It's hard to bank on, but just at the very least, like if another team wants him, then it would probably be better if he is extended, for an extra season or two, just because, then you're not running into the issue of, well, we could trade for him and then he just walks. But maybe some teams might be more comfortable with that. In the new CBA, I would say 100% gets extended.
Yeah.
I still think he probably will, but it wouldn't be 100% just because,
Sure.
with the new CBA that you have to navigate.
Sure.
Yeah, so let us know your thoughts in the comments about the Dallas Mavericks, and what do you think? Maybe we're underestimating them a little bit too much, right? I mean, they were 39 and 43 last year, right? So over under 40 and a half basically means that you think they're going to be worse than last year. But again, last year you have to factor in, what they were before the Luka trade and post Luka trade, and how healthy their guys were. So there is a case to be made that like they had a bunch of injuries. So if they're even remotely a little healthier, it could be more than, 40 wins. But I just, like you said, how much can you trust that that's going to happen? I just don't know. So,
yeah.
But now we're moving on into our second team that we're discussing. That was also a play-in team, a different situation. The Miami Heat, right? The Miami Heat were also another team, in fairness, right? That last year made a pretty significant trade, right? And that was trading Jimmy Butler to the Golden State Warriors, right? Now, unlike the Mavs, right? They didn't really get another really good player back, for Jimmy Butler, right? I mean, they kind of sold him at a pretty low point, right? That Butler trade, I mean, that ended up being a massive trade that involved several teams, right? That ended up being what? Like, I think it was a 4-team trade, right? Involving the Warriors, the Heat, the Jazz, and the Pistons, right? Where, Butler goes to Golden State, and then Miami got back Wiggins, Kyle Anderson, 2025 first round pick, which I think they used to take a guard that we'll talk about when we factor in their offseason. But I guess the big part of that Heat trade was getting back Wiggins, I guess, right? And, again, Wiggins is a solid player. He's not Jimmy Butler, but he is a guy that can play both ends of the floor. And, he was a champion. But the other key piece of that deal was getting back Davion Mitchell, right, from the Sacramento Kings, right? And that was a guy who ended up playing a lot for the Miami Heat, right? In kind of this role where he's coming off the bench, but basically playing starters minutes, defensive-minded guard that also shot the ball really well for the Heat. And that was kind of his issue in Sacramento, is that, offensively, what is this guy? Because he's a very small guard. He's super physical. He's a kind of a big guy for a guard, but he's not very tall. But then last year he shot 40% from three, which is kind of what you were looking for, because before that, he was kind of like an average three-point shooter for his career, 34% for his career. But then in Toronto, shot 36%, and then in Miami, shot 45% from three. So can he be 45%? Probably not. But if he can be somewhere around league average or better, right, that automatically raises his value, because we know he's a good, tough, physical defender who can even, again, run some spot offense for you a little bit, right? Not necessarily as a scorer, but just as an extra playmaker. But in the summer, right, they ended up doing a couple things, right? They took Kasparis Giacosionis, right, in the draft, and we saw him in the summer league, right? His first, I think, what was it, the Utah Summer League, he didn't look that great. But then in Vegas, he looked better, right? And again, Summer League you always take with a grain of salt. But just another guy where, again, not a great athlete, right? But again, if the jump shot continues to be there, then, he could be a serviceable point guard. Probably not like a starter, I don't necessarily think. But, again, worse, maybe like a decent backup guard, right? Something like that. But not anything I think to necessarily get too crazy over, in my opinion. Like just a guy that's like, I think will be okay, decent.
Yeah.
But the big thing that they did this summer was they brought in Norman Powell, right? Which kind of came out of nowhere, because I mean, you kind of thought that the Heat might do something. I mean, they were mostly tied to Kevin Durant, but that ended up not happening at all. Even though the package seemed like Miami really must have just not been all that interested in getting him, unless they just thought they could lowball the Suns. But either way, They did get Norman Powell and didn't have to give up much, right? It was like Kevin Love and Kyle Anderson, who, Kyle Anderson, they got in the Butler deal. So from that perspective, you got back a good player who basically had a career year for very little. And he is a guy that can help them on the offensive end. And that is mostly where the Heat struggle, right? Because their problem is they've been a good defensive team the last few years, but they cannot score. Have been a very limited offensive team. And you're getting a guy who last year averaged over 20 a game and shot almost 50 from the field and over 40% from three. So again, is that going to continue? Considering that for the most part, that's been, pretty well above what he's been as a player. But, for his career, he's a 40% three-point shooter. So, it's just the issue is he's already 31. Now he's actually now 32. So what does that look like in Miami? And he's not going to be playing with the same tier of offensive players. He's not going to be playing next to Kawhi, next to Harden, the other year before that, right? He was playing with those two guys plus Paul George and Zubac. Zubac's still there. But now he's going to be playing Tyler Herro, Bam Adebayo, and then after that, just kind of a bevy of other guys. So maybe the efficiency takes a hit, but at the very least, he should still be able to score because he's going to have opportunities to have the ball in his hands. Curious to see if he starts because he was a starter for the Clippers last year after mostly being a backup. So I'm very curious to see what that looks like. But just, as a whole, not a crazy active offseason. Now, recently they also did trade Haywood Highsmith, right? Didn't really get much of anything back, right? So, I guess they were just kind of just doing that as a salary dump. But either way, when I look at this roster, it's tough because, again, without Jimmy Butler, they pretty much fell off. They ended up making the playoffs, and they were, the first 10 seed to make the playoffs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they just ended up having, two really strong play-in performances.
Mm-hmm.
But then they got annihilated by the Cavs. So, just kind of what was the point of all that? But with Norman Powell, you could at least make the case that the Heat may be a little bit better than when they first traded Jimmy Butler. It's just hard for me to bank on them being really, really good. You know what I mean? They're in the Eastern Conference, so there is at least a little bit more room for error than what there would be in the Western Conference, right? Like if they were in the West, it'd be a different story. But in the Eastern Conference, there's no real reason why they couldn't be in a similar position again. Like, could they make the play-in and then get into the playoffs? Sure. Could they even make the top 6? Maybe, but a lot of things I think would probably have to go right in order for that to be the case, just because I think there's a few teams that, if they're healthy, on paper should be better than the Miami Heat. Just especially because, again, their two best players, again, they're good players. And Herro was an all-star last year, and Bam has been an all-star. But just as a whole, I don't know how much more upside there's going to be with that group. Like, if those two guys are your best players, it's hard for me to envision that being a really, really good team. Just because, we've already kind of seen what that looks like. So, again, thank goodness for them they're in the East. So they'll probably still be in the mix again in the playoffs, but or in the regular season. But playoff-wise, I think it's hard for me to make the case that they're going to be able to win multiple rounds and, kind of be the Heat team of old that we saw the last few years where they, still surprised and shocked the world by making deep playoff runs, but they had Jimmy Butler, who just was a better player than any of these other guys on this roster. They don't have that now. So, offseason wise, I guess B-, because, I like the Norman Powell acquisition, but, other than that, it's kind of just mediocre. So, honestly, I might just drop it to like a C, like a C, just because, again, Norman Powell's fine, but, again, whatever the best case version of this is, I just don't think is a great team. So, it's okay. It's not the worst offseason you could have had in the world because there's a worse version where they don't do anything. But either way, is this going to change life for them? I just don't necessarily feel like that's the case. They also re-signed Davion Mitchell, so I should point that out as well. But just, this is kind of mid, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm giving them a C as well. There's things that I like and there's things that I don't like. I like Norman Powell. I like their rookie, Kasparis Giacojonas, but it doesn't put them over the hump, right? Because I think they had a good, solid base of guys, right? Like I was an advocate. I liked the Heat season last year based on the fact that you really got to see what Tyler Herro at his true potential really looks like, and I liked it, right? I like his offensive game. I like that.
Oh yeah.
Bam took a step back, I think, and that's the problem with a team like that where Tyler Herro and Bam Adebayo are your best two players. I don't think the ceiling for that team is very high. However, it's not the worst thing in the world, like you said. So bringing in a guy like Norman Powell, who had a very good season last year, definitely could have been an all-star. If NBA politics weren't really a thing. Numbers wise, I mean, it should help them out, but I don't think it's going to be a deep playoff run or anything like that.
Right.
Still kind of solid. Sold on the young guys. I think Hawkes needs a bounce back year. Jovic, what does he look like? So
in year 4?
Yeah, I think he's in year 4. So there are some questions, I think, for sure. Kella Ware, what does he look like as well? Wiggins, does he stay on the roster? So off season wise, I mean, it's kind of hard to grade because they didn't really do an insane amount, right? And they lost what was it, Duncan Robinson, Kyle Anderson, and I think Kevin Love as well. So I think the gains outweigh the losses here, right? I give them a pat on the back for Norman Powell. I like the draft pick, but it doesn't make me feel too confident about what they look like in the future and probably next year. The East is going to be weak, but I don't think they're going to be a strong team in this weak Eastern Conference. They're probably going to be one of the weaker ones, if you want me to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, honestly, and that's kind of where, again, that's where the C is, because like you said, you balance it all out. Because again, Norman Powell, good trade, good deal. You got back a good player for basically nothing. The draft pick, Yakashionis, solid draft pick, but just not really much else other than that, and just not enough for me to feel like that they changed their destiny in any way. Not that that was even going to be the case. And then, like you said, the young guys, right? Because their young core, I mean, I guess Bam and Herro are still relatively young, right? But then, you look at what else they have. Again, Khalil Ware looked pretty good as a rookie, right? We'll see, like you said, what he looks like in year 2. If there's a drop off at all, because eventually they shifted to, because initially he wasn't playing at all. Then they shifted to a 2-big lineup where he and Bam are together a lot and they start together. But then after that, like you said, Hawkes, he's, since his rookie year, where he had a really strong rookie year, he's had a drop off. All of a sudden feels like a lot of the weaknesses that were in his game that people thought that he had in college have now kind of shown up, because you would especially think after the Jimmy Butler trade, he'd be playing a lot, but he really wasn't playing.
Yeah.
Like, even post Butler trade, when they were, hanging on and trying to make the playoffs, like he just was not part of the rotation really at all. And that to me is kind of a concern, considering, again, like you said, he's one of the handful of young guys that they have, and they seemingly didn't want to give up any of those guys in a potential KD trade. So, who knows there? That's kind of a tricky situation to navigate. Rozier's on an expiring. Don't know if they'll be able to get rid of that. Kind of wild how that just didn't really work out, because he was really good in Charlotte, but just in Miami, it has not panned out at all. I don't think he's still under investigation. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think that anything has been decided from that one as of yet, but just as a whole, just super bizarre how that just ended up not really working at all.
Yeah.
But either way, now the ball's in Herro's hands more, and he's now more comfortable inside the arc, right? With his floater, being able to drive more comfortably to the basket. But it's still a problem of he's your best perimeter player. And, that's not something that I think you really want if you're going to be a really good team, in my opinion. But, even though, again, even though he's a good player and he was an all-star and had a great year last year, but still, I wouldn't want him to be my best offensive player, if I'm trying to win a lot of games. And that's kind of the issue for this team moving forward. So the Durant thing, what was going on there? Like, I guess if you're the Heat, considering what it seemed like the Suns were asking for, which didn't seem like a crazy amount, what's the deal going on there? That just seemed like kind of a weird random thing going on, where it just seemed like they weren't willing to give up anyone. Now, maybe they have their eyes set on someone else, I don't know, but they've not really gotten anybody in recent memory.
Yeah, that
Since
was weird.
yeah, I mean, like they just haven't really landed anybody in recent history. I don't think off the top of my head. So I guess they were just like, well, let's just get Norman Powell for nothing and then do other stuff from there. I don't know. It's
Yeah,
kind of hard to
I hope they
gauge for me. I'm
weren't.
not quite sure what to expect from the Heat at this point going forward. Just because post Jimmy Butler, it just feels like they're kind of shifting into a new situation. But they also are not a team that really tanks a whole lot. So that's where you're kind of wondering, like, what does this team look like moving forward? Especially you mentioned Wiggins, right? Because he was in trade rumors, right? Because there were talks about maybe the Lakers go grab him for Rui and some other guys, but I guess if you're the Heat, what do you do at this point? Like, are you kind of just, are you fine with what they're doing right now?
Not really, because they can't build through the draft. I hope they weren't chasing after Giannis. The fact that they turned down the KD offer was ridiculous in my opinion. I think that was one where you kind of just greenlight that no matter what, because they're in desperate need of some star power, especially a certified guy who doesn't really suffer on one end of the floor, right? Because that's the problem, right? Bam's not the most polished offensive guy, and Tyler Hero is definitely not the most disciplined or effective defender. So that's the problem. You need a solid guy who's not going to get attacked on either end of the floor.
Yeah, and again, you probably wouldn't pick them to come out of the East, but in this version of the Eastern Conference, you could at least make a case that like that's a good team. Like that's a team that if everything goes right, maybe they could win a round or two, but it would still probably be tough. But like you said, the cost was so low. But maybe maybe that just wasn't his preferred choice as well, and maybe they got word of that and they didn't do it. But I don't know. It's kind of tough to gauge from there. Now they're over under. If we're looking at the Miami Heat, their over under is 39.5. Now this is the Eastern Conference, right? And we know that the Heat usually don't really want to tank. So what are we thinking here? Last year they won, I believe, 36 games.
Yeah. Probably go under. I'm gonna go under on this one. I don't think it's going to translate to a lot of wins. It's going to be this kind of the same story as last year. I know the East is weaker, but they're still not at the top of the East, right? It'd be different if they were at the middle or an area like that. But I feel like they're just not that good. They're not going to be that good.
Yeah, I mean, this one is I think kind of a tricky over under, just because like again in the Eastern Conference they could be a little bit better than some people think, because you do have Norman Powell and he could help him out. But yeah, I just don't really. I mean, once you start talking about under, then you're going to like 35, 36 wins, and that just seems very low for this Heat team in the Eastern Conference. So that one's just kind of a tough one. I may have to go slightly over just because they could get to 40, 41, but then that kind of conflicts with, say like, some of these other teams that are a little bit better than them. I don't know. I may actually go over on this one, but like I said, 40, 41 wins. I think is probably the max.
Yeah.
But I could definitely see being wrong on this one.
Okay.
But the East is tricky.
Yeah, it is.
But at the very least, so like, if that's the case, where do you rank the Heat then in the Eastern Conference? So, like, do you think that like even if if you could pick the under, but do you think they could still make the playoffs?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Just because the East is going to be a very, very weird conference next year, right? With multiple teams kind of out of play. I think multiple are going to be taking a step back. I guess in theory, right, without Boston really in the play, without potentially Milwaukee, being super elite, right? Shout out to the Bucks, by the way. But
the Bucks are going to be worse than the Heat.
That's tough because I like the Heat's all-around roster more than the Bucks, but I do like Giannis and what he's able to do by himself a little bit more than the Heat collective, I think. So I'd probably go with Milwaukee probably being a little bit better, not by much, but
okay,
because the talent is not there for Milwaukee. I can tell you that right now, outside of Giannis, but. I'm thinking like Orlando's going to take a step forward. Atlanta's going to skyrocket up. Chicago probably stays the same. Toronto, I think they're a potential sleeper to get some more wins in that, win column.
Sure.
I think Philly will probably slot better than Miami. So that's kind of my thought process on it. I think Indiana will be better than Miami. How about that? Like, I just feel like Miami will probably be in the 8 to 9 range, maybe 9, 10. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, so like similar spot to last year.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe just because the East might be worse, like they could move up. But
Mm-hmm.
still, if they're in the bottom half of the playoffs, it's be pretty hard to expect them to win a playoff series. I'm not
Right.
predicting them to win a playoff series anyway.
No.
It's just a matter of can they make it. They could still make it. It's just if you're the Heat, what is the ideal scenario? Like if you're the Heat, do you want to make the playoffs and be like an 8 seed with this team?
No, I mean realistically, like you already said it, they're not going to tank, but I think they should give a shot at tanking because I mean I know they're good at finding these diamond in the rough kind of guys, late lottery or even like right outside of it, but is that really going to net you a whole lot of wins? Like I get it, Heat culture, that's great, for the franchise, but long term, right? The end goal should always be a title, and you were very close multiple times, post LeBron era, but I think they need to take a step back and really target, some up and coming prospects. That's what I would. That's my advice.
Yeah, and again, like you said, we'll see what the Heat do, but it's just a tough, tricky situation, especially because again, I could see them looking at the Eastern Conference and just being like, if we just hold on and maybe there's like a decent deal waiting at the deadline, maybe we could do something and make some noise or something like that. And I think that's very enticing. It's just again, unless it's the right tier of player, I just don't necessarily know. I don't really feel like the ceiling is going to be that great regardless. And like
I
you
agree.
said, that's kind of the part where you're trying to figure out, how to rank some of these teams. Because we should, because at some point we'll probably have to do like a tier of the different teams in the conferences just because, we're still in the off season period.
Yeah.
We're still in the summer, trying to come up with some good content. But I guess the question is like, do you buy Norman Powell's production from last year and like feel like that it's going to be replicable in Miami?
Yeah. Yeah, I have no problem with that, and especially on a team like this. I know Miami's probably not as good defensively as the what the Clippers are, but I think Norman Powell will be able to get his own shots and still be efficient. So I don't really expect a crazy drop off, but yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it.
What's your starting five for Miami?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good question. I mean, I definitely wouldn't start the rookie, Yaka Jonas. I would probably start Herro at the 1. Yeah, that's the problem. 2, Norman Powell. 3, maybe probably Wiggins, right? 4, Bam. 5, Kellel. Where? That's what I would go with.
You still feel good about so you still like the idea of starting Bam at the 4?
Yeah, he shouldn't be playing the 5. Respectfully, I know he can guard 1 through 5, but I'd like him more as a roamer, right? To cut guys off on the perimeter. We've been talking about that, since the Miami Heat guys brought us onto their podcast. Yeah. So shout out to them. But it's like it shouldn't be this difficult, right? If you know ball, I'm pretty sure you would ideally like Bam to be at the 4. I guess it does come down to the fact of, is the 21-year-old Kello Ware ready to be a starting center in the NBA? That's the question.
Right. Yeah, and in the summer league, right? I mean, he didn't really play a whole lot, if I'm not mistaken, right? Like we didn't really see it. When we were there, we didn't see him play at all. I mean, in fairness, we only saw I think 1 or 2 Heat games, but it seems like that they're kind of taking their time in terms of like figuring out what to do with him. And again, I'm sure just like last year, he got opportunities towards the latter part of the season, but it is kind of funny just because of the fact that it seemed like his stock shot up over the course of, leading up into the draft because he was not projected as like a top, 15 or so draft pick, right?
Not
he was
even.
looked at kind of like in the second half of the first round in that draft. Just because, again, there were also questions about, the intangible stuff like the motor and other things. It wasn't necessarily just the skill set point, but
yeah,
but again, like I am curious to see what this team looks like post Jimmy Butler, just because again, it before they got Jimmy, right? They were kind of in this weird stretch where like they weren't the worst team in the league necessarily, but it just felt, but like, they had a couple of seasons where I think it was like what Deion Waiters and a couple other guys, right? And they were better than expected. And then boom, they just kind of get Jimmy Butler out of nowhere. And then even then, when they first grabbed him, they weren't really looked at as a championship contender team. Then they go to the finals a couple of times, and now they're kind of in this weird spot where now they're pretty close to being in one of the toughest spots to beat, just because it's like not quite good enough to really be a contender, but also not horrible enough to be a lottery team, and they just don't necessarily have enough there. So we'll see what happens, from that regard, just because again, they just the fall from grace pretty quick. But just especially because again, Pat Riley, right? Like that's a guy that's regarded as, one of the elite team builders in the league, but it just feels like the last few years it's just kind of all gone downhill. Davion Mitchell, what do you think you expect from him? Any updates with him?
Big things, right? Very good defender. Very, very good. Obviously we already know, very short, but can still give you a little bit of things offensively. So I'm kind of hoping that he can find his rhythm there, but defensively I expect him to be, just as solid as he has been all the other years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Again, if the offensive, production continues to uptick, that's a guy that could kind of, I don't know if sneakily is the right word, but move into the starting realm.
Yeah,
Just again, is that a guy that you want as your starting point guard? Like on a really good team? Probably not. But just again, if the offense continues to improve, which it seems like it is, right? Then that's a guy who, again, worst case scenario, is going to get a lot of minutes. And that was the case. Do you buy the shooting uptick?
yeah, yeah. I think it's legit. Yeah, I don't think it was a fluke or anything like that.
Yeah, so yeah, well again, let us know your thoughts in the comments about the Miami Heat and their offseason. We're gonna go into some news and rumors. So I guess we'll start off with the Malik Beasley one. So according to Shams Charania, right, there was a report that was put out there. His lawyers told ESPN that the veteran guard is no longer the target of a federal gambling investigation, which now I guess opens the door for him to potentially sign with some teams. Now, obviously, for the Detroit Pistons, they could, in theory, bring him back, right? Because they did, they still have his, I believe they don't have his bird rights, but because he was on the team, they can increase his salary by a little bit. He was going to get, I believe, what was it, like a 3-year, $42 million deal from the Detroit Pistons. But now that's going to be out the window because they just don't have enough. Now they've, because they don't have the bird rights and everything else like that. So we'll see and also, well, actually, it's mainly because they already signed, some guys because they didn't know what was going to happen with him, right? Like they didn't know that whether or not he was going to be able to come back, and they weren't going to necessarily wait, right? They brought in Duncan Robinson,
Yep.
And Schroeder's gone. So we'll see what happens there. Now the reporting is that teams like the Knicks, the Cavs have contacted him. Now they don't have a whole lot to give him. I believe they're basically like minimum contracts because they've already used their money and resources, on other players. But, again, if he was on their roster, that'd be another solid shooter, rotational guy. Again, we know come playoff time, probably not going to be quite as productive as he is in the regular season. But, again, those teams, by and large, are constructed in ways where, like, you can absorb a guy like Malik Beasley and, still be fine, because Cleveland has the big guys. They added Lonzo Ball. So, like, they do have rim protection. They do have some length. The Knicks, again, their core defensive group, they have the wings, right? So, like, you could have some lineups where he could just be out there, again, just be like a guy that can take some attention off of these other guys as a three-point shooter. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that would be amazing, for him to come back, into the league. I'm glad that, the investigation has been wrapped up or whatever. So, we can kind of move past that. Kind of screwed over, I think, Detroit in terms of what they were trying to do, unfortunately. But, I would love for him to go to New York. That would be awesome. That's pretty much instant, knockdown shooter. And I think that's something that they desperately need. Or not desperately need, but they definitely need that.
And again, like he could go in theory anywhere, just
Right,
because
right.
again, those teams can only offer the minimum, and there's
Hmm.
teams that can offer more. I don't know how much those teams are gonna offer him. And of course, as I mentioned, he could also just go back to Detroit, just
That too.
not for the amount that he was gonna get. I don't know, if they're gonna do that, just because like they've already used resources on other players. But just as a whole, I am kind of curious to see where he goes, because I think there's a lot of options there. I think, again, like I said, every team could use, especially in the regular season, a guy like a Malik Beasley where, everybody's kind of cold, not scoring a whole lot, but then he can kind of just get hot and open up your offense. And again, we've already seen in the playoffs, probably not going to be as helpful, but you got to get through the regular season anyways. And he was very good for the Pistons last year, right? I mean, he was one of the leaders in Sixth Man of the Year voting. He didn't win it, but he was actually my pick because he was really good last year.
Yeah.
So, moving on. According to Jake Fisher, Golden State has pursued LeBron multiple times. The Warriors contacted the Lakers on multiple occasions over the last 18 months to pair stuff with LeBron. I remember hearing about some of this stuff. What was it, like two seasons ago, right? Where I remember, and that was when they had Anthony Davis. That was way before they got Luka, right? Where there was kind of talks about like Golden State was, because they didn't do anything 2 deadlines ago, right? They didn't make any real moves. So I remember like there was reports about like them contacting the Lakers and contacting LeBron, trying to figure out like, hey, are you interested in going there? Nothing's really come up of that. I just don't think it's going to happen. Again, we've already talked about multiple times that I think the most likely scenario is that he finished this season in LA, right?
Yeah.
Like where he doesn't get traded and plays out the year. Whatever happens after that happens. Maybe he comes back to LA and resigns and retires there. Maybe he goes elsewhere. But for this season, I don't think he's going anywhere.
Yeah, respectfully, he's not going anywhere, and he's definitely not going to Golden State.
Yeah, and again, even regardless of what would happen, you'd still have to have this scenario where they have to compile and put together the contracts to make the move work. And Golden State has their own stuff to figure out right now with Kuminga, and presumably I guess he'd be part of the package unless you're putting Jimmy Butler in there.
Sure.
But I don't. Who knows? I don't think it's gonna happen. I think we're kind of past that point. I understand. Just why there's an interest in that, just because again we know both guys have wanted to play together for a while. And again, like I said, I don't think that LeBron's relationship with the Lakers is at its strongest, but I just don't think he's going anywhere, and I definitely don't think he's going to cause a stink and make it ugly. I just think he'll be there, he'll play, and then whatever happens happens. Like I said, I think the Lakers will be good, but he's not going anywhere, I don't think.
Yeah.
Well, now I guess we'll get into, as we usually do, we'll get into some of our comments. Well, no, I guess we got a couple other things that we'll mention. So the Pacers did extend Rick Carlisle, multi-year extension. No issues with that. I mean, they went to the finals. Obviously, it's going to be a gap year next year. They could still be solid. They could still be okay, but they're not going to be anywhere close to the tier that they were last year because they don't have their best player, and that's the guy that makes all of this work. But bringing Carlisle back, I think, is the right move.
Yeah, underrated coach for sure. And he has the title experience. He has, finals experience. So why not keep going, keep it rolling?
Yeah. So now we can get into the comments and the polls that we usually do on IG. So for our last post, we were talking about the Philadelphia 76ers, and we asked the question of, will the 76ers make the NBA Finals? And we actually got a 50-50 set of responses for that one. So people seem to be pretty split on this Philadelphia 76ers team.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think there's a lot of people that think they're going to make the finals, but I could see, the logic there because realistically, right, if say Joel Embiid has like the greatest bounce back season that we've ever seen, you already have Maxey, you have, the younger guys as well, Jared McCain, what do they look like, VJ Edgecombe, so hey, I'm not going to buy it, but I could see it.
Right. And that's why I put the question as, will they make the finals? Because if it was, can they make the finals, it may even be bigger than a 50-50. Like, it may just be like, majority yes.
Yeah, exactly.
But For will they make the finals, that's where I'm a little surprised that it's 50-50. I thought it'd be a little bit
More
more towards,
skewed.
like, I don't know, 2/3 no,
Sure, yeah, yeah.
something like that. But hey, I mean, again, I think there are people that like the talent on this team. It's
Mm,
just, again, I can't bank on or buy that they're going to be healthy. I don't see it, but I
yeah,
could be wrong.
yeah.
But then we also had a comment on the short as well from Elias A_A_ Jones. Sixers are going to 732 Pete.
Wow. Okay.
So I kind of like the comment. I think that's a pretty funny one.
Yeah. Jeez. Wow. Well, I'm sure they'll continue, their dynasty or whatever.
Yeah. So, yeah, well, I mean, again, it'd be pretty wild in my opinion. And it was funny because when I read it, I was thinking that was like the Philly area code, and I was like, well, that's not the area code for Philly.
No,
I was
that's
like,
like Jersey, right, or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's Jersey. So, I mean, I guess, yeah, they're thinking 732 times. Here we come. But they got to do the one first.
For real.
You got to win at least one before you have a chance to do anything, Pete.
Yeah. Really though.
Yes. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments on the Mavs. Let us know your thoughts on the Miami Heat as well. And let us know your thoughts on all these rumors that we've talked about. And again, if you want to leave comments on any of the shorts or any of the videos or our IG or other social posts, go to @the_OBT podcast on any of our socials. And we'll try to read them at the end of the episode and, discuss them. And of course, continue to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Because again, we've seen a lot of growth over this summer, which a little bit surprising just because, after the first month, right, free agency in the offseason has been pretty quiet. Not really much has happened in a minute. But we still appreciate all the support, and we'll see you next episode.